She couldn't explain why she kept thinking about him. He hadn't said anything particularly impressive. He hadn't done anything remarkable. Something else was happening, and it was deliberate, even if it didn't look like it. Think about the last person who stayed in your mind, not because they were the loudest in the room, not because they had the best story, not because they dressed the best or talked the most or worked the hardest to be noticed. Something else, something quieter. They said something or didn't say something, and days later you were still thinking about it, still turning it over, still trying to locate exactly what it was that made them land so differently than everyone else. You've met hundreds of people. You remember almost none of them, but you remember that one. Now here's the question no one asks. What were they actually doing beneath the surface that made that happen? Because it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't luck. There's a mechanics to it, a structural reality beneath the impression, and once you understand how it works, you'll stop trying to be memorable in ways that never worked anyway. Most men who feel overlooked make the same mistake. They diagnose the problem as output. I'm not funny enough, not interesting enough, not confident enough, not doing enough. So they add more personality, more stories, more presence, more effort, and the result is always the same. The more they add, the more forgettable they become. Not because the additions are bad, but because the entire strategy is wrong. Memorable people don't add to themselves for the sake of impression. They subtract. They remove the noise, the filler, the performance, the constant low-level effort to be received in a particular way. And what's left, the undiluted, unperformed, unmanaged version of a person, is the only thing that actually sticks. You cannot remember a performance for very long. Performances blur together, but you remember the moment someone was simply, uncomplicatedly real. Here's the first layer. It starts with what you do with silence. Most people are afraid of silence, not consciously, but functionally. Watch a group of people who don't know each other well. The moment a pause arrives, someone fills it immediately with anything, a comment, a laugh, a question, a noise. The silence feels like a gap that needs to be closed, like a problem requiring a solution. The man who is hard to forget has a different relationship with silence. He doesn't rush to fill it. He sits inside it, comfortably, without visible anxiety, and waits to see what's actually worth saying next. Sometimes nothing is, and he says nothing. That restraint, that willingness to let silence exist without managing it, does something unusual in a social environment built entirely around noise. It creates a pocket of stillness. And people are drawn to stillness the way they're drawn to a quiet room after a long day. Not because silence is impressive, because it's rare, and because a man who isn't afraid of it communicates, without a single word, that he isn't managed by the discomfort of others. That reads as control. Deep, settled, unperformative control. The second layer goes deeper. It has to do with what you pay attention to. Most people in social situations are split. Half their attention is on the conversation, half is monitoring how they're coming across. Are they landing well? Was that funny? Did that story run too long? What does her expression mean right now? This split attention produces a very specific quality in a person. You can feel it when you talk to them. They're present, but not fully. There's a background process running, a self-monitoring loop that never fully switches off. Conversations with people like this feel slightly transactional, slightly managed, like you're talking to someone who is also simultaneously talking to themselves. The man who is hard to forget switched the monitoring off, or rather, he stopped having a version of himself he needed to protect in the conversation, so there was nothing to monitor. His full attention, unguarded, unfiltered, completely given, landed on whatever was happening in front of him. And the person receiving that attention felt it immediately, not as intensity, as presence. The feeling of being fully seen, not evaluated, not managed, not half attended to, is so uncommon that it becomes associated with the person who produced it. You don't remember what he said, you remember how you felt when you were talking to him. There's a layer beneath attention. It has to do with desire, specifically with whether a man's desire for approval is visible. Every person in a social environment wants to be liked. That's not weakness, that's human. The difference is what happens to that desire.
In most men, it leaks into the laughing slightly too hard at someone else's joke, into the way they adjust their opinion when they sense disagreement, into the subtle shift in energy when someone important enters the room. None of this is dramatic. All of it is readable. People process it as this person needs something from the room.
And the moment someone needs something from you, something unnamed, unspoken, but constantly present, you stop seeing them clearly. You start managing them instead. The man who is hard to forget, his approval seeking, is genuinely quiet. Not suppressed, not white-knuckled. Quiet. Because somewhere along the way, he developed a relationship with his own worth that didn't require the room to confirm it every few minutes. He walks into a space genuinely indifferent to whether the space decides it likes him. Not cold, warm even, but indifferent to the verdict in a way that is palpable. And that indifference, that clean, easy, non-performative indifference, creates a gravitational pull that neediness never can. We move toward people who don't need us because they feel like the safest people to be around. Now we go structural. There's a pattern in how forgettable men handle conversations, and it reveals everything. They try to be interesting. They select their best stories. They frame their experiences to land well. They find angles that will generate the response they want. The entire effort is pointed outward, toward the impression, toward the effect, toward the memory they're trying to create. And the irony, the deep, almost painful irony, is that this effort is exactly what prevents the memory from forming. Because you cannot manufacture a genuine impression. You can manufacture an adequate one, a fine one that produces polite interest, but the impression that lingers, the one that stays in someone's mind 3 days later, that one was never manufactured. It arrived because the person stopped trying to create it. The man who is hard to forget isn't trying to be interesting. He's genuinely interested, not as a technique, as a default orientation. He finds people actually compelling. He asks questions he actually wants answers to. He follows threads of conversation because he's genuinely curious where they lead. And this orientation, interest without agenda, produces a quality in conversation that feels almost impossible to locate, but immediately impossible to forget, because he made you feel like the interesting one. And we never forget the people who made us feel that. There's one more layer, the deepest one. It has to do with what a man withholds, not strategically, not as a power move, but naturally, because he understands something that most people learn too late. Everything loses value when fully available. The man who shares every opinion, every experience, every feeling, every thought, the moment it's formed, creates a kind of conversational inflation. Everything he says costs the same, which means nothing he says carries particular weight. The man who is hard to forget is selective, not mysterious for its own sake, not withholding to create intrigue, but genuinely he speaks when he has something worth saying. He doesn't fill space with words. He doesn't narrate his own experience in real time. He doesn't process out loud everything he's still figuring out internally. When he speaks, there's weight behind it, because the silence preceding it was real. And people, without consciously deciding to do so, lean toward voices that carry weight. They replay them, they return to them, they find themselves days later still thinking about something he said that took only 10 seconds to say. That's not accident. That's the natural result of a man who treated his own voice as something worth reserving. Here's what this all traces back to. Every layer, the silence, the attention, the quiet desire, the genuine interest, the selective voice, every single one comes from the same root, a man who is fully inhabited. Not performing a version of himself for the current audience, not managing impressions, not calculating outputs, just fully, quietly, completely present inside his own existence. That quality, being fully inhabited, is the rarest thing in any room. Most people are half somewhere else, half in the past interaction or the next one, half in the version of themselves they're trying to construct or protect. The man who is hard to forget is entirely here, and that here-ness, that complete undefended presence, creates a vacuum. Not deliberately, not as strategy, simply as the natural consequence of being the only person in the room who is entirely themselves. Nature abhors a vacuum. People fill it. They think about him later. They bring him up in conversations he wasn't part of. They find reasons to return to his orbit without knowing exactly why. He didn't try to be unforgettable. He simply stopped trying to be anything else. And in a world full of men performing, that absence of performance became the most powerful thing in the room.